Welcome to Cozy Mystery Stories, where tradition and elegance often mask the deadliest of secrets. Our tale unfolds in the rolling hills of rural Virginia, a setting steeped in aristocratic heritage and the time-honored ritual of the fox hunt. At Sterling Manor, a gathering of the wealthy and powerful for the annual hunt breakfast seems the very picture of civility. But beneath the veneer of polished silver and scarlet coats, old grievances and desperate secrets fester, waiting for the perfect moment to erupt into murder. The fatal fox hunt. The air in the Blue Ridge foothills that morning was so crisp it seemed to crackle. It carried the scent of wood smoke, damp earth, and money so old it had long since forgotten the vulgarity of its own creation. From the grand portico of Sterling Manor, one could survey a kingdom of rolling pastures and ancient woods, all ablaze in the glorious, dying fire of late autumn. This was the stage, my dear reader, for the Sterling Cup, the most anticipated fox hunt of the Virginian season, and as the guests assembled, I found myself observing a cast of characters that could fill the pages of a most intriguing novel. One must always pay attention to the little details of human assembly, the polite smile that does not reach the eyes, the hand that lingers a fraction too long on another's arm, the voice pitched just a little too brightly. It is in these tiny, exquisite cracks that the truth so often resides. Our host, Colonel Alastair Sterling, was a man so conscious of his heritage, he seemed to be carrying the weight of his ancestors on his perfectly tailored shoulders. He stood by the roaring hearth, a glass of sherry in hand, his face a mask of patrician calm that could not quite conceal the anxious flicker in his eyes. His wife, Beatrice, was another matter entirely. 20 years his junior, she was a porcelain doll with a flicker of steel in her gaze, a woman whose beauty was both a weapon and a shield. She moved through the throng of riders in their scarlet coats and polished boots, a vision in cream wool, her laughter like the chiming of a tiny, perfect bell. The guest of honour, if such a term could be applied to a man so universally disliked, was Lord Ashworth. A visiting British peer with a booming voice and a portfolio of investments that had ensnared half the county. He possessed the unfortunate combination of monumental arrogance and very little to say of any interest. He was holding forth near the bay window, pontificating on the superiority of English hounds, English horses, and, one presumed, English air. He was a man who collected grievances from others as a child might collect stamps, and his album, I suspected, was quite full. Among the riders, I noted Miss Elena Vance, a whip-thin, sharp-tongued young woman from a rival family. She was a modern woman trapped in a world of antiquated rituals, and she wore her impatience like a second skin. Her engagement to Lord Ashworth's vapid son had been announced and then abruptly broken off the previous spring, and the chill between the two families had yet to thaw. Then there was Mr. Silas Croft, the master of hounds, a man who seemed to have been carved from the very oaks that dotted the estate. He was taciturn, rugged, his face a road-map of wind and sun. He watched the aristocratic assembly with an air of quiet contempt, his loyalty reserved for the hounds that milled about his feet. His son, Julian, was his opposite in every conceivable way. Dressed in a tweed jacket far too fashionable for the occasion, Julian had the languid, cynical air of a man recently returned from Europe, under a cloud of some unspecified scandal. He and his father communicated in monosyllables, the space between them thick with a disappointment that was almost tangible. And finally, there was Dr. Alastair Finch, a local physician who seemed entirely out of place. A quiet, bookish man with gentle eyes behind thick spectacles, he attended the hunt breakfast every year but never rode. He claimed to enjoy the spectacle, but I sensed a deeper, more academic interest, as if he were a biologist observing the curious mating rituals of a particularly exotic species. As for myself, Adelaide Pims, I am merely a distant cousin of the Sterlings, a visiting English spinster of a certain age, largely overlooked and therefore perfectly positioned to observe. For what is an old woman with her knitting but a piece of the furniture? And who, after all, pays any mind to the furniture? The call of the hunting horn, a pure, silvery note, sliced through the morning air, and the great pageant began. Riders mounted, horses snorted plumes of steam, and the pack of hounds surged forward, a river of black, white, and tan. The hunt swept across the lawns and vanished into the tree line, a fleeting vision of scarlet and gold against the muted tapestry of autumn. I remained on the veranda with Dr. Finch, watching them go. "A rather primitive spectacle, is it not?" he murmured, polishing his spectacles. "All this sound and fury, chasing one terrified little animal." "Ah, but doctor," I replied, my knitting needles clicking softly, "it is rarely about the fox, is it? It is about the chase, the assertion of dominance. It is human nature in a microcosm." My words proved more prophetic than I could have imagined. Not an hour later, the sky, which had been a placid forget-me-not blue, turned a bruised and sullen grey. The wind rose with a mournful howl, and the heavens opened. It was not a gentle autumn shower, but a deluge, a violent, almost tropical downpour that churned the streams into roaring torrents and turned the country lanes to mud. The riders came straggling back to the manor in disarray, their fine coats soaked and splattered, their faces grim. The Sterling Cup was, for the first time in its 80-year history, abandoned. It was Colonel Sterling who first raised the alarm. In the chaos of drenched guests shedding their coats and calling for hot brandy, he took a frantic head count. "Where is Ashworth?" he demanded, his voice tight with an anxiety that seemed to go beyond mere concern for a guest. "Has anyone seen Lord Ashworth?" No one had. He was not among the riders who had returned. His horse, a magnificent black stallion, had galloped back to the stables alone, wild-eyed and saddle-sore, its reins trailing in the mud. A search party was hastily assembled, a grim-faced collection of grooms and guests led by the stoic Sealer's Croft. They set out into the teeth of the storm, their lanterns casting feeble, dancing circles of light in the deepening gloom. The rest of us waited in the great drawing-room, the silence punctuated only by the drumming of the rain against the window-panes and the crackle of the fire. The storm had worsened, and the butler, Gable, entered with a grave expression to inform us that the telephone line was dead. A short while later, a stable hand arrived, soaked to the bone with even graver news. The old stone bridge over Cutter's Creek had been washed away. There was no way in or out. We were trapped. The sense of unease in the room thickened into something closer to dread. Ah, but my dear reader, the truth is often disguised in the ordinary, and a simple storm can be a most effective accomplice to malice. An hour later, the search party returned. They carried not the man himself, but his body. They had found Lord Ashworth slumped against the base of an ancient oak, half a mile from the main trail, his face a ghastly waxen mask. There was no visible wound, no sign of a fall. He simply looked, as Elena Vance whispered with a shudder, as if he had gone to sleep and never woken up. The fatal fox hunt had claimed its prize. The great drawing-room of Stirling Manor, which only that morning had been a stage for social pleasantries, had transformed into something of a courtroom. Lord Ashworth's body had been carried to a guest chamber upstairs, and we, the living, were left to stare at one another across the cavernous space, each mind whirring with suspicion. The storm raged on, a ceaseless, furious assault that served as a constant reminder of our isolation. We were a small island of humanity, cut off from the world, and somewhere on this island, a murderer moved among us. Dr. Finch had performed a cursory examination. He returned to the drawing-room, his face pale and set. "I cannot be certain without the proper tools," he announced to the silent room, "but there are no signs of physical trauma. No broken bones, no contusions consistent with a fall from his horse. However," he paused, choosing his words with a physician's care, "there was a faint, almost imperceptible odour on his lips. An odour I have encountered before in my practice. It was reminiscent of bitter almonds." A collective gasp went through the room. Cyanide. The word hung in the air, ugly and venomous. This was no accident. This was murder, cold and calculated. Colonel Sterling, looking haggard, tried to assert some semblance of control. "No one is to leave this room," he declared, his voice lacking its usual authority. "We must wait for the storm to pass for the police to arrive." But we all knew that could be days. Until then, we were both jury and suspects. It was then that I decided my role as a quiet observer must, of necessity, expand. The human mind, particularly when under duress, is a fascinating puzzle, and I have always found puzzles to be irresistible. One must always consider the little grey cells, and mine were beginning to stir from their comfortable holiday. "Perhaps, Colonel," I said, my voice mild, "while we wait, it would be prudent to establish the facts as we know them. It may help to clear the air." My suggestion was met with a mixture of surprise and relief. I was the outsider, the harmless old woman. I held no stake in their intricate web of relationships, and so, under the flickering gaslights, my gentle inquiry began. I started with our host. The Colonel's desperation was plain to see. He admitted, under my quiet questioning, that his finances were in a ruinous state. Lord Ashworth had been on the verge of signing a deal that would have saved Stirling Manor. "The man was a scoundrel," the Colonel blustered, dabbing his brow with a handkerchief. "But I needed his capital. His death, it destroys me. Utterly destroys me. A compelling motive for keeping the man alive, I noted, but perhaps a more compelling one for murder if the deal had already soured." Next, I spoke with Beatrice, his lovely wife. I commented on her exquisite riding gloves, which lay on a nearby table. "Such a beautiful pair," I murmured, "though I see one is missing its lace trim." She snatched the gloves up, her cheeks flushing. "I must have snagged it on a branch," she said quickly, too quickly. I had seen her earlier that day before the hunt, and I was quite certain both gloves had been intact. She could provide no clear account of her whereabouts after the hunt was called off, claiming she had retired to her room with a headache. A headache, my dear reader, is often a most convenient ailment. The clues, such as they were, began to accumulate, like dust motes in a sunbeam, each insignificant on its own, but together forming a cloudy picture. A stable boy, when questioned, mentioned that Lord Ashworth's saddle had a freshly broken stirrup strap. "Looked like it had been cut, ma'am, clean as a whistle," he'd whispered, his eyes wide. An attempt to cause a fatal riding accident. When that failed, had the murderer resorted to a more direct method? This led me to Sealer's Croft. The master of hounds had been the one to discover the faulty strap. "A poor bit of leather, that's all," he'd grunted, dismissing it. "Rich men buy fancy tack, not strong tack." He was a man of few words, his face an unreadable mask. Yet I observed his hands as he spoke of Ashworth. They were steady, strong hands, hands that knew their way around leather and knives. He claimed to have been with the hounds the entire time, but who could corroborate the testimony of a dozen dogs? His son, Julian, was a more agitated subject. He paced the room like a caged panther, chain-smoking pungent Turkish cigarettes. He admitted to arguing with Ashworth shortly before the hunt. "The man was a boor and a cheat," he snapped. "He swindled me in a card game in Monaco last year." I was merely reminding him of his debt. Later, during a discreet search of the guest rooms, a necessary if impolite measure in such circumstances, a book was found on Julian's nightstand, a treatise on obscure poisons. He claimed it was research for a novel he was writing. A rather flimsy excuse, but not an impossible one. Elena Vance was, as always, direct. "Yes, I argued with him," she said, her chin held high. "He made a promise to my father concerning some land boundaries, and, characteristically, he broke it. I told him he was a man of no honor. I am glad he is dead." Such honesty was refreshing, but it was also a daringly open admission of motive. Was it genuine candor or a clever double bluff? And then there was the matter of a small silver flask. It had been found by Gable, the butler, tucked beneath a fern near where the body lay. It was not Lord Ashworth's own flask, which was found, full of brandy, in his coat pocket. This one was ornate, monogrammed with the letter B. Beatrice's initial. When confronted with it, she turned deathly pale. "It is mine," she whispered. "It was a gift from my husband, but it was stolen from my dressing room weeks ago, I swear it." The pieces were beginning to form a picture, but it was a confusing one, full of contradictions. The cut stirrup suggested a premeditated plan, one that required skill with horses and equipment. The poison, however, was a different sort of murder altogether. It was intimate, requiring the victim to accept a drink from his killer. The torn lace from a glove, the monogrammed flask, they pointed directly at Beatrice. Julian's book and his public argument made him a viable suspect. The Colonel's financial ruin gave him the most classic of motives. Each thread I pulled seemed to lead to a different person. Ah, but dear reader, that is the art of a well-constructed crime. It is designed to overwhelm, to present a surfeit of possibilities, so that the simple, logical truth is obscured. My quiet investigation continued over the next day. The storm did not abate. The atmosphere in the manor grew thick with suspicion and fear. Tempers frayed. Accusations were whispered in corners. Beatrice and the Colonel were barely speaking. Julian Croft avoided everyone, shutting himself in the library. During this time, a second, smaller incident occurred. Dr. Finch's medical bag, which he had left in the hall, was tampered with. A small vial of digitalis, used for heart conditions but lethal in high doses, was found to be missing. The theft sent a fresh wave of terror through the house. Was the killer planning to strike again? Dr. Finch was deeply distressed. "It makes no sense," he murmured, more to himself than to me. "The cyanide was swift. Digitalis is slow, agonizing. It is a different kind of cruelty." His words struck a chord within my mind. A different kind of cruelty. The methods were indeed different. The cut stirrup, a crime of opportunity and brute force. The cyanide in the flask, a crime of intimacy and deception. The stolen digitalis, a crime of lingering malice. It was as if we were not dealing with one murderer, but three. Or perhaps we were dealing with one very clever murderer who wished us to think so. The little grey cells buzzed with activity. The solution, I felt, was not in the clues themselves, but in the pattern they created. And a pattern was at last beginning to emerge. By the morning of the third day, the rain had lessened to a mournful drizzle, but the river remained impassable, and the mood within Stirling Manor had grown dark and curdled. The frayed nerves of the guests were stretched to their breaking point. An accusation between the Colonel and Julian Croft nearly came to blows, and Beatrice had locked herself in her room, refusing to speak to anyone. The order of the house was collapsing, replaced by the primitive law of fear. It was time, I decided, to bring matters to a head. I asked Gable, whose composure had remained a small, steady island in our sea of chaos, to request that everyone assemble in the drawing room after luncheon. There was grumbling, of course, but in the end they all came. They sat scattered amongst the chintz armchairs and mahogany tables, a collection of pale, haunted faces illuminated by the grim, grey light filtering through the tall windows. They looked at me with a mixture of hope and resentment. The unassuming little English lady was about to deliver her verdict. "I have asked you all here," I began, my voice calm and even, "because I believe this dreadful affair has reached a point where clarity is not only possible, but essential for our collective sanity." I stood before the fireplace, my hands clasped behind my back. The room was utterly silent, save for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. "We have been presented with a confusing array of evidence," I continued. "We have a broken stirrup, suggesting a planned accident. We have a poisoned flask, suggesting a direct and personal attack. We have a piece of a lady's glove, a book on toxicology, a powerful financial motive, and a motive of revenge. It is, by any measure, a bewildering puzzle. The clues seem to point in every direction at once. I let my gaze travel from face to face. But that, my dear friends, is the very design of the crime. It is not meant to be a straightforward narrative, but a cacophony. The purpose of all these clues was not to reveal the killer, but to obscure him. Let us for a moment dismiss the red herrings. They are the loudest, but they tell us the least. I turned first to Beatrice. My dear, your missing flask and your torn glove made you a most obvious suspect. But a woman planning to poison a man would surely not use her own monogrammed flask, would she? Nor would she be so careless as to leave a piece of her glove behind. These were not clues, they were accusations planted for us to find. Beatrice let out a shaky breath, a flicker of relief in her eyes. And Julian, I went on, turning to the young man. Your public argument and your rather morbid literary tastes also cast you in a poor light. But again, it is all too obvious. A true poisoner does not advertise his interests. Your book was not a clue, it was a distraction. I then addressed the Colonel and Elena Vance. Your motives were real and powerful. Desperation and honor have driven many to terrible acts. But your actions since the murder have been those of shocked and frightened people, not of cunning killers attempting to conceal their guilt. Having cleared the stage of its most prominent actors, I was left with the quieter figures in the background. So, who does that leave us with? It leaves us with a crime that required several things: an intimate knowledge of the Sterling estate and the hunt itself, the skill to tamper with riding equipment without being noticed, the opportunity to approach Lord Ashworth alone after he was unseated, and a motive so deep and so personal that it would justify such a complex and risky endeavour. One must always consider the little grey cells, and mine tell me that the motive here was not about money or a recent squabble. It was about something much, much older. The air in the room was electric. I had stripped away the superficial layers, and now we were nearing the core of the matter. The murder was attempted in 2 stages, I stated. First, the accident with the stirrup. This was the work of someone who knew horses, someone who could make the sabotage look like wear and tear. When Lord Ashworth was merely thrown, not killed, the murderer moved to stage 2. He knew the woods. He knew where a disoriented rider might wander. He approached his victim not as an aggressor, but as a helper, offering a drink from a flask. A flask that I am certain was not the one we found. The monogrammed flask belonging to Mrs. Sterling was planted later near the body to create a false trail. I paused, allowing the weight of my words to settle. And who had the knowledge, the skill, and the opportunity? Who moves through this world of aristocrats as a servant, yet is master of his own domain of field and forest? Who knew that the poison for his flask could be derived from the crush? Ed laurel leaves that grow in abundance by Cutter's Creek. A country poison that would mimic a heart seizure and might have gone undetected, were it not for Dr. Finch's sharp nose. All eyes in the room slowly, inexorably, turned towards the one man who had remained silent and impassive throughout the entire ordeal. The man standing by the door, as if ready to depart. Silas Croft. He did not flinch under the collective gaze of the room. The master of hounds stood as still as the ancient oaks he knew so well, his weathered face betraying no emotion. It was Julian, his son, who broke the silence with a choked sob. "Father, no. Be quiet, boy," Silas Croft said, his voice low and steady, a rumble of distant thunder. It was not a denial, I continued, my own voice softer now. This was never about a card game or a land deal. This was about a ghost from a very distant past, a ghost from a small tenant farm in Devonshire, England. I saw a flicker of shock in the Colonel's eyes. He knew nothing of this, of course not. The pasts of the men who serve are of little interest to the men they serve. Decades ago, I narrated, a greedy young landowner, the new lord of the manor, wished to acquire a piece of land tended by the same family for generations. He could not buy it, so he took it. He framed the farmer's son for poaching on his land, planting evidence and bribing witnesses. The boy was sent to prison. His family lost their farm, their name, their everything. The father died of a broken heart. The boy, upon his release, was forced to emigrate to start a new life under a new name. That landowner was a young Lord Ashworth, and that boy was you, wasn't it, Mr. Croft? Silas Croft's eyes met mine. They were not the eyes of a murderer, but of a man who had carried an impossible weight for a lifetime and had finally set it down. He didn't recognize me, Silas said, his voice raspy with a story 40 years old. I've been here 15 years. I've served him drink, held his horse, and all that time he looked right through me. To him, I was just part of the scenery, but I never forgot his face, never for a single day. The puzzle pieces clicked into their final, dreadful places. The rage had simmered for decades. When Ashworth had arranged his visit, Silas knew his moment for justice, or what he considered justice, had finally come. The stirrup was my first plan, he admitted, his voice devoid of remorse. It was how his father, the old lord, died. A hunting accident. I thought there would be a certain poetry to it, but he was a better rider than I gave him credit for. When he was just unseated, I knew I had to use the flask. It was a kinder death than he deserved. And the other clues, I prompted gently. The flask, the glove. My son, Silas gestured towards Julian with a nod. The boy discovered an old letter of my mother S. He figured out who Ashworth was. He's been trying to talk me out of it for weeks. He was the one arguing with Ashworth, trying to warn him away to get him to leave. After it was done, Julian panicked. He tried to help me to throw suspicion elsewhere. He took Mrs. Sterling's flask from her room. He tore a bit of lace from a glove he found. He stole the doctor's medicine. Foolish, clumsy things, the acts of a frightened boy trying to protect his father. Julian buried his face in his hands, his fashionable, cynical veneer stripped away to reveal the terrified child beneath. Silas Croft stood tall, a man who had appointed himself judge, jury, and executioner. "You call it murder," he said, his gaze sweeping the room of stunned aristocrats. "I call it a debt paid in full. The law protected him then because he was a lord and I was a farmer's son. I knew the law would not help me now. So I administered my own. There was nothing left to say. A profound and terrible silence descended upon the room. We were faced with a crime, but we had also been shown a great injustice. Lord Ashworth was a man no one would mourn, and his killer was a man whose motives, born of profound suffering, were unsettlingly easy to understand. The moral lines, once so clear, had become hopelessly blurred. Just then, from the world outside our prison came a new sound. Faint at first, then growing louder, it was the unmistakable chug of an engine, the sound of a truck labouring through the mud. A road crew. The bridge must have been repaired. The outside world was returning. Help was arriving. The police would be called, statements would be taken, and the slow, impersonal machinery of justice would begin to turn. Silas Croft did not try to run. He simply walked to the window and looked out at the rain-soaked hills, his hills, a strange expression of peace on his face. The hunt was over, for everyone. The inhabitants of Stirling Manor were free from their physical confinement, but I knew that the psychological scars of that weekend, the chilling knowledge of the darkness that lay coiled beneath the polished surface of their world, would endure forever.